Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on EMV, and we're going to focus on third-party retrofit kits today. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you an agenda of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to go over a couple housekeeping items. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Conexxus. I'm going to introduce the presenters. We'll get to the main presentation, and then we'll do Q&A. And I will say that we generally get a lot of questions when it comes to EMV, so I would encourage you to put your questions in early so that we get those covered for you. So first, let me introduce myself. My name is Linda Toth. I'm the Managing Director for Conexxus, and I'm the moderator for today. And there's a couple housekeeping items here. The webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available in approximately 7 days on our YouTube channel or through our website. The slide deck will be made available immediately after the presentation, or about an hour or so after. You'll get a survey, and if you fill out the survey, there will be a link at the end of it, so you can download that deck immediately. And I would encourage you to fill out the survey. The survey results really help us determine how effective the webinars are, how useful they are, and it gives you a good opportunity to give us ideas on future topics. So again, make sure you ask the questions via the webinar interface. You are on mute. I would ask that you would refrain from vendor-specific questions. We have a lot of vendors on here, but we don't want to get into specifics for the vendors. And finally, our webinars may be used towards PCI continuing education. So if you would like to get credit for that, please contact Allie, and her email address is on the deck or slide there. Next slide. So I wanted to just tell you a little bit about Conexxus. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are the member trade association for convenience and retail fuels. We focus on standards and technology. In addition, we are independent from NACS. I know a lot of you are NACS members, but that doesn't make you a Conexxus member, and vice versa. Next slide. So Conexxus does a lot of educational opportunities throughout the year, including monthly webinars that are free. And here you see a couple of them that we did recently. If you're interested in any of those are out on our website or our YouTube channel. And then you can also see the ones coming up right after the first of the year. Next slide. So I did want to give a shout out to our 2020 Diamond sponsors. These folks go above and beyond and provide an annual sponsorship to the organization and allow us to do extra things that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So thank you for all of them. And then finally, let me introduce the presenters today. So again, my name's Linda Toth. I've got Russ Haker from Dover Fueling Solutions. I have Julie Scharf from Visa. We have Bill Pittman from Sound Payments. We have Dan Harrell from Invenco, and we have Dan Whitkepper from Gilbarco. And if your question doesn't get answered today, you can reach out to any of us. You can reach out to Conexxus, or you can reach out to any of the vendors. You can see their emails there, and you'll get that in the deck. So with that, I'd like to introduce Julie Scharf, from Visa, who will start us off. Take it away, Julie.
Okay, great. Thank you, Linda. Hi, everyone. As Linda mentioned, I'm part of the Visa organization. I'm part of our consumer products group, and I've been working on fuel and fuel payments in-store and outdoor at Automated Fuel Dispensers, or AFDs, as I generally refer to them, for a number of years, about almost 10 years now. So I have some information to share with you about the upcoming EMV liability shift, which happens in April. So let's take it to the next slide, and I'll dive right in. If you can harken back to 2011, I know it seems like a long time ago because it was. Back then is when Visa announced our roadmap to EMV migration in the US. EMV, which is the chip that's in your credit cards and debit cards, it had already been pretty commonplace worldwide, but the US was really one of the last geographies to move to chip payments. So back in 2011, we explained to the US how it was going to work from an incentive perspective. There are no rules, there's no requirements, but we did put in incentives to encourage card issuers, so the banks that put cards in people's wallets, and merchants, those folks like you who accept cards, to enable for EMV or chip. So in 2015, there was a liability shift for non-fuel merchants, which basically protected non-fuel merchants from the cost of bearing counterfeit fraud transactions as long as they were ready for EMV. Similarly, at that same time in 2011, we said, because we understand that the fuel environment is much more complex, complicated, the hardware has shorter turnover cycles, et cetera, we gave an additional 2 years for fuel merchants to be ready in their forecourts for EMV. And that was very well received by the industry back in 2011, who basically was like, thank you for recognizing that we have a really complicated infrastructure. Well, cut to 2016, and we recognized at Visa that the fuel environment was still not ready. It was still not, we still weren't seeing the adoption and the rollout that we were expecting, which is why in 2016, we pushed that 2017 date out to 2020. Well, then coronavirus happened. So earlier this year, we said, look, we know we've been kicking the can down the road, but coronavirus was unprecedented. And so we basically gave an additional 6 months. So where we stand now is in April of 2021, counterfeit fraud that takes place at fuel dispensers that are not ready for EMV will be a cost borne by the retailer, not the issuer. Right now, the issuer of the card has to eat all of that fraud, and started in April, the merchant where the transaction took place will have to start paying for the fraud that takes place. So, you know, back up a little bit further beyond even 2011, why are we doing EMV in the first place? And on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see why. It's because EMV decreases counterfeit fraud. It is a scientific way to guard against counterfeit transactions from taking place at payment terminals. So you'll see that from back in before the liability shift, which is the incentive program, went into place in 2015 compared to earlier this year, counterfeit fraud at chip-enabled merchants in the US dropped nearly 90%. And therefore, across the US overall, it dropped 65%. So it just shows you that putting counterfeit prevention mitigation measures in place, such as EMV and other things, is a foolproof way to cut down on counterfeit fraud and to eliminate it from the system. And that's just what we want to do. So if we shift to the next slide, I'll just show you the very bare details of what I'm talking about here. So effective April 2021, the only time that a merchant or an acquirer, so who's the bank that supports the merchant, is responsible for counterfeit fraud will be when a chip card, I'm looking at the bottom row here, when a chip card is used at a terminal that is not chip enabled, that's magstripe only. That is the only time that the merchant or acquirer would have responsibility for counterfeit fraud. Again, the issuer of the card eats it in all other circumstances. But if it's a chip card presented at a terminal that's not ready for chip, we feel like the terminal or the merchant hasn't pulled their weight, and that's why they are going to have to bear the cost. There are no plans for this April 2021 date to be extended. It was sort of a strange, confluence of events earlier this year with shipping delays and hardware availability and potential supply chain disruption that caused this additional minor 6-month delay. But April 2021 is coming. You do not want this fraud. You do not want to eat this fraud. Fraud is expensive. If fraud has to exist, you don't want it on your forecourt. If it has to exist, you want it to go elsewhere. So that's why we're telling you about this now. April's coming soon, and you do need to be ready, or you will start to bear cost of fraud that you're not experiencing today. So the good news, though, on the next slide, is that the merchants are starting to understand the benefits of EMV chip. In this article on the right-hand side in the Next Daily, Conexxus, the generous host of today's webinar, reported that retailers are beginning to recognize the benefits of EMV chip. They estimated that the outdoor fuel dispenser fraud totals will exceed $450 million in 2020. You do not want even a small fraction of that. the best way, the only way to prevent that from happening to you is to have counterfeit prevention methods such as EMV enablement at your forecourt. What they also found, Conexxus, in the survey that they conducted and featured in this article, was that nearly 81% of the respondents to the survey said that they've already deployed or are planning to deploy EMV at their AFDs, their automated fuel dispensers. And back in February at the Payment Summit in Salt Lake City, I reported that 1 in 10 Visa transactions at a gas pump were chip-on-chip. And I'm pleased to report that as of September, it's 1 in 4. So we've gone from 10% to 25% of automated fuel dispenser transactions that are taking place at chip terminals. So that number continues to climb. So that's another reason for you just to get on board if you're not already. It's because everybody else is doing it and you don't want to be the one left holding all of the counterfeit fraud. The next slide will show that, as we all know, this has been a very strange year for cash and for checkout experiences overall. I don't need to tell you that. You all run businesses. Payments in general has had a very unusual year. But as a way to help small business owners primarily, which again, many of you are, Visa recently conducted a back to business study, which you can find on visa.com. It's free if anybody wants to read it. In amongst other conclusions that it was able to draw, it also found that contactless is key to businesses reopening in or after the pandemic. What is contactless? Contactless is tap to pay. So the ability for customers to not even have to touch the terminal, for them just to hover their phone or mobile device over it for the transaction to take place. You've seen it in stores. It's coming to gas pumps as well. Some of the stats that we found in the back to business study is that 70% of customers have changed the way they pay this year. More than half of them would switch to a new store if that store had contactless payment available. And 1 out of 3 have already switched to contactless payment whenever it's possible. People don't want to touch things. It's become this very strange interaction at payment terminals where you don't want to have to, enter your phone number or enter your card or swipe your card, or, you don't want to touch anything for fear of, coronavirus. So that's what's happening. That bottom graphic highlights the benefits of EMV, which I already talked about. The chip cards, they're secure, convenient, scalable, and they're seamless. All of these same things apply to contactless or tap to pay payments, because tap to pay payments are also EMV payments. They use the same infrastructure and the same counterfeit prevention technology that inserted chip card payments use. So they're as secure, they're as safe, they're just touchless EMV. So that's really the content that I wanted to share with everybody. If you switch to the next slide, I'll just summarize that there are a lot of people that can help. If you're one of those few merchants out there, few gas providers out there who hasn't started or doesn't have a plan for EMV, now is the time to get there. And these folks, your hardware providers, your software providers, the folks on the phone coming after me, your acquirer or your payment terminal provider can all help you. Visa can help you. We have a ton of resources here if you have questions or you want to be pointed in the right direction. So contact this list of helpers with your questions or for assistance. And while you're putting in EMV chip, don't forget to add EMV contactless chip at the same time. There's no use doing one without the other and then having to go back in a year or two once tap to pay is the norm for all payments and spend the additional money to put in contactless readers at your dispensers that you just touched a year or two ago. So that's all from me. Make sure you're ready for EMV, and while you're at it, add EMV contactless or tap to pay at the same time. There would be time for questions at the end, as Linda mentioned, but at this point, I will pass it on over to Dan Whitkemper to cover some additional information.
Wonderful. Thanks, Julie. Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Whitkemper with Gabarco, and I'm going to start off walking through some updated information from the PCI Council pertaining to PIN entry devices. By the way, PIN entry devices, or PEDs, are those devices on your counters inside the store, as well as the payment solutions on your forecourts as well. There's a link on this slide that will take you to the full bulletin. You will receive a copy of this slide deck after the presentation, so you'll be able to use that link to get to the entire bulletin once again. There's two terms I want to make sure that you're familiar with before we move on to the next slide. The first term is around the PCI device expiration date. That's the last date the device can be installed in the field at a site. Noting that if there is a like-for-like replacements because there's a device that gets damaged, that is permitted as well. And secondly is the revised sunset date. And that's the date now that a device must be replaced in the field. And we're going to talk more about that as we get to the next slide. So Russ, let's go ahead into the next one. So the first column on this table shows the various PCI versions, 1 through 5. The middle column is showing that PCI device expiration date. Again, that's the last date a specific PCI certification revision can be installed in the field. Really no changes there. That's been around for quite some time. You're going to notice the PCI 3 devices are permitted to be installed until April 30th of 2021. And after that date, only devices that are PCI 4 or PCI 5 are allowed to be installed in the field. That far right column, this is that revised sunset date. This is a new item for the industry. And what I want to bring your attention to now is that first row that indicates that any device that's PCI 1 or prior must be removed from service by December of 2022. So that's just 2 short years away. So basically those PCI 1 devices need to be removed from service and then replaced with something that is current. So in that case, that means it's going to be either a PCI 2, 3, 4, 5 device. So something newer than the PCI 1 that's still permitted to be installed. So from a revision perspective, again, you want to look for the things that are in green as you're talking to your equipment providers and ask them what their current sunset dates are for, or what revision of PCI they have, so you can match up the sunset dates to go along with those. Again, sunset dates are the dates that devices need to be removed from the field. So again, key thing that retailers need to understand from this slide is just that devices now have sunset dates. It's important for you to speak with your equipment providers and technicians, understanding what level of PCI device you have and what they offer in terms of a replacement. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill Pittman to talk about encryption.
Hey, thank you, Dan. So you did a great job talking about security from a hardware perspective, but there's more to it than just the hardware. So the hardware device itself has to be PCI certified and be secure. But after that, what happens to the data once it's transferred, once it's entered into the device? And so there's another thing that you need to think about as you're upgrading your hardware and you're thinking about the future, and that's encryption. And so there's 2 different types of encryption that go on that are related to this. Both of them, once you enter the card, the data gets encrypted and it's sent off and it's secure. The only person that can unencrypt the data is the credit card processor. But so you have really two paths here to go from. One, well, I guess you have 3. Let's say one is you don't have any encryption at all, which I think in today's world is not a good thing. But going forward, you have something called end-to-end encryption. And that is once the card data is entered into the device, it's encrypted with a key specific to that processor. So they're the only other person that can unencrypt it. And then that data is sent off to the processor to be processed. So that's one form of encryption. The other one is the point-to-point encryption. And that's where not only is the data encrypted, but the whole device is managed. And by that I mean is that the device itself is made to be tamper-proof, and if anybody messes with it, that it'll stop working. And so that's really the big difference is like how far you want to go down the line of security with regards to the data. And I put a link in here as well where I'm talking about all the companies and all their solutions and everything else that have been point-to-point encryption. From what I've seen today, end-to-end encryption is kind of like the standard. Point-to-point encryption is what's coming, and bigger companies are more worried about that because there's been all kinds of breaches on devices, and that they want to make sure that their device is managed properly. So those are kind of the 2 things you need to think about. So not only do you have the PCI security requirements that Dan talked about on the hardware itself, you've also got the data encryption to think about. So, you know, these are all things that we do for you, and you may not even think about it normally, but it's like it's one of the reasons, part of our value add service that we give you is that we are thinking about these things, and all of us vendors are doing our best to not only ensure that you've got a secure solution, but that you've got something for the future that will help keep your business safe down the road. All right, so that's next slide.
Great, thanks, Bill. So now let's discuss merchant options for upgrading to EMV support on the forecourt. There's a couple of different options to select from to begin accepting EMV chip cards on the forecourt. One of those is to update the entire dispenser and payment solution with a new one with EMV capabilities. Another is to take a newer pump that doesn't have EMV yet and then add an EMV retrofit kit. And those kits come in a couple different forms. You can purchase those directly from a dispenser manufacturer, or there's third-party providers that also provide them as well. We can go on to the next slide. So one consideration to keep in mind as you're making your forecourt EMV decision revolves around upfront costs. And you know, the costs consist of things like equipment, installation, possibly permitting, which your technician can help you with that last item there. Additionally, reduction in maintenance costs might be a factor if you're considering a new dispenser with an EMV payment terminal that comes with a warranty. And lastly, you should evaluate what the site's image impact would be after the upgrade, because oftentimes retailers tell us that they've experienced increased traffic at their sites when they've upgraded technology on the forecourt that can be seen from the street. So give some thought to that, as well as new features and capabilities that you may not have with your current solution that's non-EMV as you move towards an EMV solution. So now I'm going to turn it over to Russ Haker to discuss EMV retrofit kits.
Thanks, Dan. A little bit about retrofit kits and certifications. A lot of this stuff should not be new to most of you in the industry. We'll start with UL. Most of these things here in this list are the responsibility of the equipment providers, not necessarily the merchant, but these are good things to be aware of, to inquire about from both your equipment suppliers and the service personnel who are doing the installs on your site. All EMV retrofits must be UL certified. UL is the entity in this market for pretty much every consumer and industrial device from a fire and safety perspective. UL is required especially because we're dealing with hazardous materials in hazardous locations due to the fuels that are dispensed. One of the key things here, though, is that both the retrofit kits or the devices themselves and the actual process to install them or to upgrade them have to be certified by UL. And again, this falls on the responsibility of the equipment providers. The key thing here is if they're not, and a fire marshal happens to, visit your site while this work is going on, and they see that the process or the equipment is not UL certified, they can shut down that operation right there. One of the things that we've noticed too that I think is key in some markets is some of the marshals also require certified electricians to be performing any electrical work. We've seen that pop up here and there in some of these installations. From a PCI and EMV code perspective, Dan Whitkemper already talked about part of this, about PCI 3 versus 4. And again, this is the responsibility of the equipment provider. This April 2021 date affects the equipment providers from the standpoint of what we can ship out of our factory to customers out in the field. So after April 2021, we'll only be shipping at least PCI 4.x devices or 5.x devices. The EMV code side of the equation involves the network certification, which is referred to as L3 or level 3. There's multiple levels of certification from an EMV standpoint. L1 and L2 deal with the payment terminal itself, and then L2 is specifically with the payment terminal card reader combined with the EPS or the PIN pad and the software kernel that's used to facilitate payments at the terminal. The L3 certification is the marrying of all that equipment and software on the forecourt with the point of sale system or the EPS solution on site, or in some cases all the way out to the payment host network provider. Another additional requirement that you may have alongside L3 is certification by a major oil brand. In many cases where you're dealing with someone like Shell, Chevron, ExxonMobil, The major oil is the payment network, and they also have lab test certifications, user acceptance testing that has to be completed before a device can be installed in the field. So that's one thing to check if you're flying a major oil brand flag, that any solution you're looking to put on the forecourt is approved by the major oil brand. And lastly, there's ADA to consider. These are fairly old standards going back to 2012, and I have yet to see an EMV retrofit solution that doesn't meet the height requirements once it's installed on a pump in either of these two scenarios. But again, it's something to look for as you're considering your EMV upgrades. And then the last thing I'll speak about here, we have a whole slide dedicated to this because it's a pretty big deal. In the past, all payment transaction has happened typically on the twisted pair that runs underground using proprietary vendor protocol, either from the dispenser equipment provider or the POS provider. And so that's happened on the copper wires traveling underground. EMV does require an Ethernet network on site, or a TCP/IP network. And the protocol that's used, again, can either be vendor proprietary protocol, or recently, since this is an industry-wide move to TCP/IP, Conexxus has released a standard protocol to be used as well. But this is certainly a must for your site. And if you don't have a TCP/IP network or Ethernet-capable network on your site, this is some pre-work that must be done. And there's multiple ways to do this. Even besides just running hard cable, that's one method you can do, but there are other solutions out there on the market as well. And with that, I'm going to pass it, I think, back to Bill to talk about certifications in a little more in depth.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things we're trying to do is educate you on all the different things that us vendors have to do to give you a compliant product that works. And one of the things that we have to do is we have to get certified. And so there's a couple of different certifications that we do from working with the processor. So we either go directly to the oil company if they've got their own switch. Typically, to do something like that, they got to be bank sponsored, and they've got to have they've got to have the volume to justify it. The other option is to work through a processor like First Data, Heartland, etc. And they're piggybacking across that processor cert to make everything work. And this is stuff that we do all behind the scenes. So that's what I want to really stress with you is that sometimes people look at what we provide as a vendor and think like, oh my God, it's really expensive. But the reality is there's a million different things. We talked about PCI, we talked about encryption, now we're talking about processor certs. I can just go down the list of all the different things that we have to do to give you a viable solution in the marketplace. And so, yeah, it gets expensive sometimes. And so this is one of the things that we have to do to give you a viable solution. So with that, well, if anyone has questions afterwards, I'm fine with that. But EMV actually really complicated the processor cert requirements down the road. And so, we've had to really step up as vendors and provide, a lot more stuff in order to make that certification work and to give you a viable product. So we're all in the same boat, but it just drives up the cost of us being able to provide you a viable product. All right, we can go to the next one. So like here's, one of the slides I put here to kind of show you. If you look onto the right, you can't really see it that well, but these are all the check boxes we have. So when we do a certification, we have to cert first for the in-store, then we have to cert for the pay at the pump, then we have to cert contactless, then we have to cert, magstripe. We have to, there's like it takes really, there's a lot of work and it takes a long time to get there. And you may not realize all of that sometimes when you're thinking, what the heck? But the reality is all of us vendors go through the same process to give you a product that's viable. And there's actually a lot of time and work that goes involved in giving you that product that works. All right. Next slide.
Thanks, Bill. So now that you have EMV retrofits as an option for you to get to your outdoor EMV implementation, you have some traditional ways to go about purchasing it and even some new ways. So in the more traditional implementation, you can buy these retrofit kits and basically you own them for their lifetime. But once they're outside of warranty, you're responsible for all the repairs, et cetera, that go into those retrofits as you own them for the years to come. Leasing, just as we've always had traditionally, and you can do with cars, you can also do it with equipment purchases on your forecourt. In this case, you're basically signing a deal with a leasing company who, in a manner of speaking, is financing that the EMV retrofit equipment for you. But just as with buying the equipment, when that is out of warranty, you're responsible for repairs, much the same way you would be responsible for the repairs on your car before you return something back from a leasing option. There's actually a new option where you can get EMV on your forecourt as a service. And in this particular case, you'll have a lower upfront installation charge that you'll be responsible for paying up front, but it's less than the actual cost of the equipment by far. And for the life of that contract, the equipment is actually owned by the manufacturer. And as a result, they're responsible for all the warranties and service repairs for those units for the lifetime of the contract. And at the end of that contract, you have the option to renew or perhaps replace that equipment with something else that you want to have in place. Next slide, Russ. So how do we get started? First and foremost, the most important thing is to understand what your inventory of equipment is today. So you need to know who your pump manufacturer and models are, because if you're going to order EMV retrofit kits, that kit is going to be specific to the pumps that you have. Russ talked a little bit about the requirement for an Ethernet network. So you need to know if you have Cat5 in the ground already. And if you don't, you need to talk to the different manufacturers about the options they have for providing you Ethernet from the pumps to inside of your store. And then you also need to be aware of what POS brand you're running and the version of software that you have, because as you make that migration to outdoor EMV, you need to make sure that either you have the version that you need or that you're planning an upgrade to it at the same time. Another thing you might want to do is really think about what are your goals for the EMV investment. Are you just trying to get the liability shift out of the way, or are you looking to get more out of that EMV investment? Julie talked a little bit about contactless, making things more touchless for your customers, or maybe thinking about customer engagement technologies that help to drive traffic in your store or to reach out to your customers in a variety of different ways. And that really gets to number 3, which is making sure that you're choosing a solution that aligns with your overall strategy. And as such, making sure that you've taken care of liabilities and any kind of integration problems that might be there as a result. So making sure that you have the correct certifications in the solution, making sure the right capabilities you have for you for now and in the future, and making sure you're getting a good value for your investment. And so lastly, you want to work with your installer to set an upgrade date. There are still quite a number of people who are going to be making this transition between now and April. So those schedules are going to fill up quick. And we all know that January and February are not great times to do installations in the northern part of the country. So make sure you have a plan for getting those installations done, and then absolutely execute and get them done so that you don't have to worry about this liability shift. So I'm going to hand it now over to, who's taking it next? Linda, I believe.
I'll take it. Yeah, I'll take it back. Thanks, Dan. So the last thing we wanted to leave you with is some resources. So these are all free. Out on the Conexxus website at conexxus.org/EMV, you'll find all kinds of good resources on EMV. There's a resource guide which will give you various topics, answers to frequently asked questions. It'll give you resources to other webinars, white papers, etc. if you're interested in particular topics. Conexxus has also done 3 different surveys on EMV preparedness for the industry, and all of those results are out there. Also, just a fun fact, we have a countdown clock on there, and it's 133 days to the liability shift. So it literally is right around the corner. And if you haven't gotten started, I would really encourage you to make a game plan and figure out what you're going to do. It is going to take you some time to get that implemented. There's also a link out here for the infographic that the Merchant Advisory Group did. Conexxus and some other industry SMEs contributed the content to this. And especially if you're branded, this is free to download and distribute to your sites. It's just a very clear sort of step-by-step guide on those steps you need to do to get EMV enabled. You can download that. There's a link on our website, conexxus.org, and then also it's on knowyourpayments.com, and you see the URL there. There's also podcasts available on convenience.org. There's over the last year and a half, 2 years, there's been several on EMV, so I would encourage you to check those out. Also, I failed to mention webinars. So Conexxus has some historic EMV webinars that you might find valuable on other topics related to EMV. And if by chance you got the invitation to this webinar as a forward, feel free to sign up for the newsletters where you'll get information on each monthly webinar. You can do that by dropping us an email at webinars@conexxus.org. And then finally, I wanted to leave you with some vendor websites. So there's all kinds of people. We had some really great speakers today, and I really want to thank Julie, Dan, Russ, and Bill. There's other vendors out there as well that are doing third-party retrofit kits, including Bennett and others. So I've listed some of the vendor websites here where you can find information about EMV and some of their products. So I would encourage you to check those out. It looks like we have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A, and there was quite a few that came in. If you didn't get a chance to ask your questions yet, feel free to go ahead and type in the chat, or not in the chat, in the Q&A section. Type those in and we'll get to as many as we can. So let's see here. First up, so Julie, you stated that if the site was EMV ready, that the merchant wouldn't be responsible. But what does ready actually mean? Is that implemented, or does it have to be just installed, or does it actually have to be running as well?
It has to be processing EMV transactions. So I do recognize that the first step in migration to EMV is to put in the hardware, potentially before you've uploaded the software or made it active. It does not count as an EMV transaction until it's actually trying to be processed as one. So that's the way to avoid counterfeit liability, is to start processing EMV transactions, not just have the hardware appear there.
Okay. So question about fallback. If there's an EMV failure and you fall back to mag stripe, what's the liability rules on that?
The liability rules for that would be the issuer owns liability, responsibility for any counterfeit that takes place on that. So as long as you're doing your part and you have a good EMV hardware and software solution in, if for some reason the card can't be read as EMV, it's not your fault, it's the card's fault. That being said, there is a whole additional benefit to reading chip-on-chip transactions that I didn't even cover. In that regards lost stolen fraud, which is the other half of fraud. For Visa, chip-on-chip transactions are also devoid of liability for merchants if it's a lost stolen fraud transaction. So what that means is if you do a fallback transaction at your pump, you will be taking on liability for lost stolen, whereas if you send them inside, you won't be. That's why our recommendation for fallback, even though you're not taking in any additional counterfeit liability, you will be taking on additional lost stolen liability. We recommend any fallback transaction, send them inside.
Okay. So with EMV compliance, will this discontinue the need for cashiers to check a valid ID to support the credit card transaction? Julie?
Cashiers shouldn't really be checking IDs. There's no reason for that. So if that's happening today, that can stop as is. But yes, EMV will help ensure that transactions are even more secure than magstripe transactions are. So there can be an additional element of comfort there. But for whomever asks that question, please let me know if you have installed rules or regulations for your cashiers to check IDs, because that's not really something you need to be doing, or frankly should be doing on Visa transactions.
Okay. We had a question about the upcharge for contactless option at the pump, and unfortunately we can't get into specific costs. What I would encourage you to do is reach out to your distributors, or if you're large enough, to your vendors, and talk to them about pricing for that particular contactless option. There is an additional cost, but that's going to vary depending on your vendor and or distributor. Let's see, what percentage of EMV transactions are contactless? That sounds like a Julie question.
Well, that depends on the vertical, the type of transaction we're talking about. What I can say is that contactless acceptance is becoming nearly ubiquitous in the US. 9 out of 10 of Visa's top issuers are putting contactless cards in their customers' wallets. Well over 80, close to 90% of top US merchants have contactless enabled at their locations. So because nearly all cards are EMV, I think it's something like 99 or 98% of all volume in the US takes place on EMV cards. Those are the cards that are being presented at terminals, and most terminals in the US are contactless capable and contactless enabled. So, you know, I don't have an exact number for what percentage of EMV transactions are contactless EMV transactions, but suffice it to say, contactless and tap to pay in general in the US overall is taking off. It's ramping up very, very quickly, as you all have all seen as customers and shoppers in the US.
Can I add something to that, Linda?
Of course.
So I think it's also important, and Julie, I'm sure you guys have this data because you're Visa after all, but from an international perspective, I think it's important to look at what other markets are doing. And, you know, the US is the last market to really adopt EMV compared to, say, Europe or parts of Asia Pacific that are on their second or third iteration of EMV standards. So it also reasons that they're further ahead with contactless. And, you know, you look at some markets in Asia Pacific, like Australia, they're boasting above 90% of their retail transactions are contactless today. So I think that is the direction this market is headed into. It's just going to take time to get there. And I think the biggest hurdle right now is consumers knowing when and where they can use their contactless technology that's already in their wallets.
Okay, good point. Let's see here.
One other point I wanted to kind of add to that is that I agree contactless is a great technology. And Julie and I have had a discussion on this, but also entering your zip code kind of defeats the purpose. And so what I'd love to see is a non-recommendation of not having to enter your zip code.
Okay. Let's see, next question here. So Julie, this is maybe a question for you and at Visa. In terms of counterfeit fraud, you know, you said that, you know, 25% of the transactions are now EMV. Are you seeing fraud staying in the system and just moving to like non-EMV sites, or can you comment on that without like giving us, I guess, specifics that are proprietary to Visa?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's absolutely what happened in 2015 with the liability shift that took place at non-EMV points of sale. The fraud at first remained, it just shifted to the least secure places. But then over time, as the ecosystem got bulked up with counterfeit prevention mitigation, i.e. EMV enablement, the fraud was eradicated. So at this early stage in the sub 25% range, it's hard to tell exactly if the fraud's moving around or if there's going to be a shift. Also, fraud is a 6-month delayed number because of all the back and forth that takes place between the customer, the bank, the merchant, and the chargeback systems. So we don't have a finger on the pulse exactly as to what the May and June numbers were, but suffice it to say, the people that have EMV in won't see fraud, and the people who don't we'll see the same or greater fraud, especially in the near term.
Okay, thanks. We have a question about car washes. So, a lot of times you can purchase a car wash at the dispenser, but for those that have a separate payment terminal at the car wash entry, what are the liability rules for that payment terminal sitting at the car wash? Is that considered indoor or is that considered the outdoor date?
That's considered non-fuel terminal. So that date was 2015. So in store, at car wash, at any other sort of non-fuel pump. It's very specific to the MCC that covers fuel pumps, MCC 5542. That was the only one that was extended beyond 2015. So the car wash liability, in-store convenience store liability, QSR liability, all shifted in 2015, which means that for any counterfeit transaction that takes place at a location that's not EMV capable, the liability for that counterfeit falls to the merchant, not the issuer. And car washes fall into that.
Okay. So we have a couple of questions here that are very vendor specific, and we can't answer those directly. What I would say is if you have questions about what integrations are available today, please contact the vendors directly. Or if you don't have a relationship directly with your vendor, talk to your major oil. Talk to your distributors, and they can help you figure out what solutions are available.
Julie, I'm sorry, Linda, I'll add to that. I see a lot of questions in here about certifications. The website addresses that are in this presentation, almost all the vendors on these pages have links to certification schedules where you can go find out some of that information.
Okay, great. So we have a couple questions here actually on zip code and AVS, whether or not it's required for EMV, about what are the other card brands doing. Can somebody, maybe Julie and then somebody else, if you know what the other brands are doing, comment on AVS, whether it's going to be required once EMV is implemented, et cetera?
I can comment from Visa, and I'm sure anybody else can hop in with any other perspectives. Zip code is not required for the most part at Visa. Zip code is not required as part of an automated fuel dispenser transaction. There are 10 high fraud geographies in the US where zip code is mandated, simply due to the fact that the fraud in those geographies was so high that the merchants, in fact, asked us to mandate it, so as to ensure that all merchants on the same street corner were requiring the same zip code entry. So barring those 10 distinctly high fraud cities and states, AVS, or address verification system, aka zip code entry, is not a requirement. Merchants can choose whether or not they want to do it. There's not liability shift that goes along with it. It does require touching the terminal. That's why, it's up to you. And it's not something that's required. It's something that I recommend for you as a merchant to consider as part of your overall fraud mitigation strategy, because an address or a zip code does help ensure that that card wasn't stolen by someone. It's one additional way to prevent you from owning liability of a potentially lost stolen transaction that potentially falls back to MAG. So, all that being said, it's kind of a non-answer. It's generally not a requirement, and we leave it up to the merchant as to whether or not you want to do it. I don't know about the other brands.
Does anybody want to comment on any of the other brands? Okay, then we'll move on. So this question has to do with fallback, and Visa is called out here specifically. I'm sure it may be similar for some of the other brands, but there's an increased cost when it comes to high fallback, like if you have high fallback rates at the store. And if they turn off fallback outside and send them inside, they still could end up with fallback inside. Is there any problem with just turning off fallback completely? Does Visa have any guidelines regarding that?
That's a good question. That's one I'll have to get back to the interrogator on. Like I said, I recommend you send outside fallback inside, but if you want to turn off altogether fallback inside, I'd have to double check if there's anything that would prevent that from being a good idea. So let me take that offline and follow up with the person who asked the question.
Okay. We've got a couple questions on fleet. So right now, most fleet cards are issued as mag stripe only. Sorry, my dog is whining. So what's the deal with fleet in terms of, is the liability shift covering fleet? And let's see, how is that handled in terms of fraud now at EMV enabled pumps? So does anybody want to take fleet?
As a reminder, the liability shift only kicks in if it's an EMV enabled card presented to an EMV, presented to a dispenser. If there's a card that's not EMV enabled, then you simply can't conduct it as an EMV transaction, and therefore that liability will remain with the issuer of that non-EMV card.
Okay, and I would just add that most of the EMV fleet programs that aren't, like Visa or MasterCard Fleet, are coming out with their own liability shift. So if you accept fleet, I would go back to the manufacturers or issuers of those particular cards that you're accepting and talk to them about their rules. In general, we haven't gotten, public information on many of the rules. So talk to your reps about that directly.
Yep.
All
yeah,
right.
I was just speaking on behalf of Visa Fleet. So yeah, good call out,
Yep.
Linda.
All right. So with more secure transactions between PCI, point-to-point, and EMV, will we see reduced rates with all the security once these transactions take place? I don't know if you want to speak to that or not. Julie, you're allowed to say no comment.
Yeah, I mean, security continues to improve, and that's best for everyone in the system. So hopefully, what we'll see, I intend that we'll see reduced rates of fraud, and all of these things are more expensive for all the players to introduce. So remains to be seen what the costs are everywhere. But I do look forward to watching counterfeit fraud rates definitely decrease.
Okay. Curious question here, Julie, specifically, of those 10 high fraud areas, are any of them in Washington? Is that available like on your website, or I think?
Yeah. Whoever asked that question, follow up with me directly. I can give you the document that outlines them. I don't think any are in Washington, but I'd have to double check. I know the entire state of Florida required AVS, but I don't remember the other cities. I don't think any of them are in Washington. I'll check.
Julie, the data that I have from you guys at Visa and some slides I've been using recently, I think it's dated from 2019. Washington is not in the top 10 states.
Okay, then the states haven't changed since we initially highlighted them, or the cities. It's mostly just cities. The only state is Florida, but the others are like New York, Chicago, LA, probably those high fraud cities that we're all well aware of. So yes, and if Washington's on there, then I take your word for it, and the answer is no, Washington's not in the top 10.
Additional point on that is that top 10 list has changed from the 2018 data to 2019 data that Visa published, which I think reinforces the notion that the fraud moves. It does not stay in the same place. So just because Washington's not on the top 10 today doesn't mean it could be. It couldn't be in the future as we see EMV upgrades sweep across the country.
That's a good point.
Bill, I have a question. Does that mean that fraud might move to the phone down the road, as an example? Has anyone thought about that? And what I mean by that is phone apps are not EMV apps.
That is correct.
Yeah. Apps, right? So I want to make sure everyone understands that. You pay a higher rate, it's a card not present app, and you have no security. And so I'm just wondering is if, as we move to EMV and everyone's got EMV at their terminals, is if fraud's going to move to the card not present apps?
I mean, that's a possibility, I think, from my perspective, Bill, from what I've seen, but it's not as holistic as magstripe technology that's out there. If somebody was going to commit fraud, say at an app level, they would have to do it at, at an independent vendor's level. For example, like a Walmart. Somebody would have to hack the Walmart app and to be able to do that. I don't know how much return there is for smaller networks versus the investment. And then you've also got tokenization involved in a lot of those instances, which is a very highly successful security schema to implement in terms of mobile payment. I mean, it's possible, but I think it would take some work, and it might not be as profitable as one might think.
Well, I'm thinking about from a retail perspective. What I saw as we implemented EMV at retail, the fraud moved to online.
I think Julie might be able to speak to this, but I think that's been a trend as EMV has been rolling out in general across the retail market.
Okay, let's move on because we are running short on time and we still got a lot of questions in here. So this is bordering on vendor-specific questions, but I'll throw it out there and let you guys answer if you know or if you have solutions. Somebody was interested in who provides solutions for high flow dispensers with EMV and contactless EMV on alphanumeric keypads, and specifically he's talking around bank card acceptance. So not just the fleets, but the bank card acceptance at high flow pumps.
And Linda, this is Dan with Gobarco. So we provide retrofit solutions for those dispenser types.
Okay.
For bank cards.
This is Russ with Dover. We also have a solution for that as well.
Same
Okay.
with Invenco. Correct.
All right. Well, hopefully that answers the question. It sounds like there's a lot of solutions out there. Question about, is there a deadline for MSD contactless? Julie, if you want to see that from a Visa perspective.
Yeah. To set to level set, MSD is an old spec of contactless, and QVSDC or EMV contactless is the new spec of contactless. For the most part, in the U.S., all contactless transactions are using the EMV contactless spec. That date has also been pushed out to April for fuel merchants, knowing that you weren't going to be putting in EMV contact specs until potentially April. EMV contactless won't be required until April 2, which means that still today there is some contactless acceptance that is MSD, which is again the old spec, and that's okay. It's okay until April. So I guess I would say that the deadline for fuel pumps it's a waiver-based deadline push that we have allowed to go until April. So as part of your EMV enablement, when you're doing your contactless enablement, just make sure it's EMV by April. And if again you have any specific questions about that or want to walk through your own specific scenario, do feel free to reach out to me. I have a team here who's dedicated specifically to the EMV contactless migration, and we can help you through that as well.
Okay, I'm going to take one last question here, and then I have a final question for all our participants or panelists. Julie, I think you covered this earlier, but I think it's important to say it again. So the question is, there's lots of sites that still aren't EMV ready. Do you think whether the date can be pushed out, and who makes those decisions about extending EMV compliance?
Each network sets its own dates. Our date differs a little from the other networks. Our date of April 17th is one that Visa set. Originally, a reminder, back in 2011 is when we came up with the roadmap. So the fact that there's still lots of sites that aren't ready is somewhat surprising, but I know, the vast majority of you on the phone today either have a plan or are about to make one. The decision for extending EMV compliance, and again, it's not a requirement, it's not a compliance issue, it's just a liability shift. If you're not ready, the only penalty is that you'll be absorbing counterfeit fraud that you could have otherwise helped eliminate. So our date, the Visa date of April 17th, 2021 is not, we do not intend to change that. People are dealing in the new normal. We went from 1 to 10 to 1 and 4 and climbing transactions that's EMV in the gas pumps. So I don't know what the other brands are thinking. I can only speak on behalf of Visa, but I see April as a really great time for everybody to be finished with their EMV migration.
All righty, thank you. So we are just right at the top of the hour. I'm going to give everybody another 20 or 30 seconds to answer this one question. So if there's one thing that you want to stress to the audience today, what would it be? And I'll start with Bill.
Okay, my answer would be is to not only think about meeting the EMV mandate, but thinking about the future. So like what technology do you want to put in that enables you down the road to meet other things that you want to do?
Okay, I'll go to Dan Whitkepper.
Sure. So you've heard several folks on the webinar make a case for not waiting, and they're exactly right there. In a prior Conexxus EMV webinar, I'd mentioned about if you wait too long or to get too close to the EMV dates, you may end up paying higher installation costs as technician resources become fully loaded, and then you end up paying in overtime or after-hours support. So pleading with retailers on this call today, please give consideration to getting updated sooner than later.
Great, thank you. Dan Harrell.
Yeah, I'm going to echo a little bit about what Bill said, which is this is a pretty considerable investment. And you really ought to be thinking about what kind of return you're getting on that investment, whether it's, we're all going to get the liability shift by getting to EMV, but thinking about customer experiences at all your locations, thinking about customer engagement, thinking about contactless payments, especially in the world of COVID. When you're making that investment, go ahead and get it done right so that you set yourself up for the future.
Okay, great. Julie?
Don't delay. Do it now. And when you're doing it, add tap to pay.
Okay, thank you. And finally, last but not least, our great person who shared the deck for everybody today. So I appreciate the extra work he had to put into that. So Russ.
I'm going to echo Dan Whitkemper and Julie. Get started today. We're already starting to see bottlenecks in certain markets with ASO service technician availability. And so in addition to what Dan said about, you know, potentially having to pay more to get those upgrades done, it may be hard to even get your site scheduled. And so if the date comes to pass and you start incurring counterfeit fraud chargebacks, now you're in between a rock and a hard place trying to pay that, you know, to pay those costs associated with the chargebacks and foot the bill for an EMV upgrade.
Okay, great. Russ, could you advance the deck one more slide, please? So that's all we have today. I really appreciate everybody's attention. As we mentioned, there will be a survey that comes out. Please take a few minutes to answer those couple of questions and provide us with any other topics you'd like to see. There's information about Conexxus. If you have some questions that didn't get answered and you didn't happen to jot down the presenter's emails, you can always email us at info@conexxus.org and I can connect you with the right person. Make sure you follow us on LinkedIn, and with that, I will say goodbye and have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.